Let's learn letter A. Look and say aloud. A. Phonic sound says A. A for apple, ant, aeroplane, arrow. Let's learn letter B. Look and say aloud. B. Phonic sound says B. B for bird, ball, banana, balloon. Let's learn letter C. Look and say aloud. C. Phonic sound says K. C for cat, carrot, cake, cap. Let's learn letter D. Look and say aloud. D. Phonic sound says D. D for dog, doll, drum, dice. Let's learn letter E. Look and say aloud. E. Phonic sound says A. E for elephant, engine, eye, eagle. Let's learn letter F. Look and say aloud. F. Phonic sound says F. F for fish, fan, flag, flower. Let's learn letter G. Look and say aloud. G. Phonic sound says G. G for grapes, guava, gun, girl. Let's learn letter H. Look and say aloud. H. Phonic sound says H. H for horse, hammer, hat, hand. Let's learn letter I. Look and say aloud. I. Phonic sound says I. I for ice cream, iron, igloo, ink pot. Let's learn letter J. Look and say aloud. J. Phonic sound says J. J for jug, joker, jellyfish, jam. Let's learn letter K. Look and say aloud. K. Phonic sound says K. K for kite, kitten, king, key. Let's learn letter L. Look and say aloud. L. Phonic sound says L. L for lion, lamb, lamp, lemon. Let's learn letter M. Look and say aloud. M. Phonic sound says M. M for mango, monkey, moon, milk. Let's learn letter N. Look and say aloud. N. Phonic sound says N. N for nest, nurse, nose, noodles. Let's learn letter O. Look and say aloud. O. Phonic sound says A. O for owl, ox, onion, olive. Let's learn letter P. Look and say aloud. P. Phonic sound says P. P for parrot, pear, penguin, piala. Let's learn letter Q. Look and say aloud. Q. Phonic sound says Q. Q for queen, quail, quill, quilt. Let's learn letter R. Look and say aloud. R. Phonic sound says R. R for rose, rabbit, ring, rat. Let's learn letter S. Look and say aloud. S. Phonic sound says sir. S for ship, star, skirt, shark. Let's learn letter T. Look and say aloud. T. Phonic sound says T. T for tiger, tortoise, telephone, tap. Let's learn letter U. Look and say aloud. U. Phonic sound says A. U for umbrella, unicorn, urn, utensils. Let's learn letter V. Look and say aloud. V. Phonic sound says V. V for van, vase, volcano, violin. Let's learn letter W. Look and say aloud. W. Phonic sound says wa. W for watermelon, watch, wool, wheel. Let's learn letter Y. Look and say aloud. Y. Phonic sound says Y. Y for yak, yo-yo, yoga, yarn. Let's learn letter Z. Look and say aloud. Z. Phonic sound says Z. Z for zebra, zip, zigzag, zero. Vegetables: tomato, potato, onion, capsicum, spinach, lemon, carrot, radish, brinjal, cauliflower, turnip.